In Chapter 1, it says, "It's dangerous to think too much about public education. So many things are wrong with it that it's easier simply to go on a search and destroy mission, and write only about the horror of it all. Those of us who have survived school have plenty of scars. Any person who has taught for more than a few years has met administrators, teachers, parents, and children who, as Mark Twain once remarked, make a body ashamed of the human race." Taylor, what do you think about that quote?
I think someone who would make a body ashamed of the human race would be someone who is just difficult, whether it's to work with or to get along with, someone who makes life hard for you. And I think what Mr. Esquith is saying, he's saying that you could bash public schooling all day, but his mission is not to do that. It's not to talk about how horrible public schools are, but how great they can be.
In the middle of the chapter, he talks about this perfect school called Camelot. And he decided once they got done talking about the Romeo and Juliet that they were going to go on a Shakespeare festival in San Diego in one weekend. So on Sunday afternoon, when they were heading back, Mr. Esquith was walking next to a girl named Jenny, and he asked her what she thought about the trip, and she said it was just okay. It wasn't as nice as the one she had stayed in Hawaii or New York. It was just okay. Shannon, why do you think that?
Well, he wanted to make a difference and wanted them to get something out of it, but truly this was something they did all the time, was used to, so it really didn't make a difference to them.
And so he got a transfer from the Camelot school to a new school he nicknamed the Jungle, which was just a regular urban school. And he decided to do the exact same field trip to go to the Shakespeare Festival in San Diego for a weekend trip. And during the orientation meeting for parents and children, there were only a few questions. Parents needed to know if their children would need passports. Were their children going to be in danger from the INS for leaving Los Angeles? The children wanted to know if there were bathrooms and beds at the hotel. Would there be a telephone to enable them to call home? And no one had mentioned Hawaii. Victoria, what do you think that?
I think that since these children were not brought up in the same way that the children from Camelot were, they probably appreciated the whole experience a lot more. They weren't concerned with all these luxury items and all these different things in hotels, and they weren't really concerned about the trip. They were focused on what they were there to do, which was watch the Shakespeare Festival and learn something. And the parents, not even knowing if their children needed a passport just to go to San Diego, kind of lets you know that these children were not brought up at all in the same way as the Camelot children who spent their free time traveling out of the country. So I think these children were a lot more appreciative of the trip. And to continue on with the differences in the schools, in Chapter 2, Mr. Esquith talks about the difference between the way the teacher's assistants reacted at each school. At Camelot, the assistants kind of fell all over him because he was a young male teacher, and he really didn't see any difference at all in the teaching assistants when he moved to the Jungle. They all thought he was very smart and witty and good looking. And when people asked him why he had such a passion and commitment to his students, he would always reply, "Because one day I want to walk down the street and people will say, 'There goes Rafe. He's the best teacher I ever saw.'" Now, most of the teaching assistants just thought this was the smartest thing that anyone had ever said, and they absolutely loved it, except for one teacher who didn't agree. And this teacher later became his wife. Taylor, what would your reaction have been if you heard one of your colleagues say this?
Well, it depended on how they would say it. I think, honestly, I would probably want my students to think that I was the best teacher they had too, and not because I wanted it for my own self-glory, but because I gave it my all and they learned lessons from me, life lessons, and that I really impacted their life, not because I was just a good teacher, but because I taught them something. If one of my male coworkers had said this, I may have reacted like his wife. I probably wouldn't have been as abrasive about it and said, you know, you're a moron for thinking this. Nobody calls anybody else a moron but your wife. But I just think that she really saw through that.
Also in Chapter 2, Mr. Esquith talks about taking his students from the jungle to a cello concert. After the concert, they were lucky enough to meet the cellist backstage. The kids were really intimidated by him and wanted to ask him a few questions. So one student asked the question, "Mr. Harrell, how can you make music that sounds that beautiful?" His answer was that, well, there are no shortcuts. Now this is the title of the book, so it kind of sums up the entire thought process for Mr. Esquith. Whenever the students returned back to school the next day, he had decided to change up the way he taught and change up the different things that the students and he did in the classroom. They extended the school hours and they also had classes on Saturdays. What do you think of the way he did things, and what do you think of the students' reaction to it, Shannon?
Well, I wouldn't want to give up my free time to go to class, but he was willing to teach them, and the kids was willing to give up their free time so they can learn more, and he was willing to learn. So basically, they was just eager to learn, period.
And one of those students who was really eager to learn was Kevin. At the end of Chapter 2, Mr. Esquith talks about Kevin's story. Kevin was a shy and reserved student who had a stutter and didn't really mingle too much with other students. When Kevin grew older, he participated in academic decathlons and was just a very, very smart young man. He came back to work with Mr. Esquith on Saturdays to tutor and teach some of his students. At the end of his time with the students, he told them his story. What do you think of his story, and how would you have reacted to it, Alicia?
Well, he had said that everybody has problems. I have problems. Victoria, you may have problems. Taylor, you may have problems. Shannon, you may have problems. And he did get rejected from Stanford, but his fellow students had spent their high school years smoking dope and ditching classes, and they had gotten accepted, and yet he was in all these decathlons, and that would have made me pretty upset. If I had worked my butt off trying to, get into a prestigious college, and these people, lazy people who don't do anything, they get into it. And then one of the students had asked how he had gone through the beatings and cruelty of the world to win a Regent scholarship, and he had said, the title of the book, "There Are No Shortcuts." And I think that is true in life, that there are no shortcuts to get through life.
Right. So at the very end of the chapter, after Kevin tells his story, Rafe writes that he had never loved another human being more than he loved that boy at that moment. Few people in the world are as strong and wise as he. Yet I didn't know on that night the cellist first spoke those magic words that my mission was only half completed. The foundation was laid and was solid. Anguish and disheartening failure were yet to come.
I think it's evident, moving on to the epilogue, that Mr. Esquith did go through a lot more trials. It starts off talking about he was kind of reflecting on this terrible day that he had. He had to walk like 2 miles in the rain. He didn't have a car. The faculty of the school had took a poll that cut out the orchestra, and Mr. Esquith was just having a terrible, terrible day. He had stayed after school that day, and two students, Danny and Karen, had stayed after to help him clean up. Now, Danny was the child in his class who everybody liked. All the girls wanted to date Danny, and all the boys wanted to be Danny's friend. And Danny was extremely smart. However, he was kind of arrogant. He didn't like it when people didn't meet up to his standards or what he thought was right. Karen, on the other hand, was very quiet, and she was reserved and didn't really pay Danny much attention, even though Karen was the only girl that Danny liked. So, staying after class one day, Mr. Asquith heard a conversation between Danny and Karen, and Danny asked Karen, he said, "Karen, I do everything in the world to try to get you to like me, and you still won't like me. Why won't you be my girlfriend?" And Karen wisely replied back and said, "Well, Danny, my boyfriend has to be nice to everyone." And I thought that was a very simple statement, but spoke so many volumes of Karen. So after Danny had left, Mr. Asquith asked Karen, he said, "Karen, how did you get so smart?" And she simply said, "Because you're my teacher." And I think that speaks volumes for Mr. Asquith as well, that he not only taught his students math and reading and writing and all the basics, but he taught them about life, and he taught them about making wise decisions and everything that they needed, not just basic academic skills. So guys, what did y'all gain from the epilogue?
Well, I thought that it did speak volumes for both Karen and Mr. Asquith. And I think it was really important that teachers teach their children not only academic things, but life lessons as well. These kids are going to look to us as more than a teacher. They're going to look to us for teaching them, a little about right and wrong and what's acceptable in society. And I think it's very wise that you need to be nice to everyone, no matter the circumstance.
Well, to me, it just shows that he has a good and positive impact on his students.
And another thing at the end of the epilogue that Mr. Asquith said after Karen made this nice statement to him, he said that he thinks that the next 20 years will be even better. And in those first 20 years, he learned a lot. He went through a lot. And I think that statement just kind of means that he's found his calling and he's found what he's good at, and he knows that he actually is making a difference now. And I think that once you know you're making a difference, it makes your job worthwhile, and it makes
it easier to look forward to the next 20 years.
Right. So thank you for listening to our podcast. This is Taylor,
Victoria,
Alicia.
Podcast. Are No Shortcuts by Rafe Esquith, and photo credit goes to npr.org.